We move forward in this story, this journey of Mr. Scrooge. You've heard this said, there's no time like... Nailed it. The present. When do we like to grab that little quip and whip it out? What's happening? What is it we want? What? Absolutely, Lois. Action. And when do we want it? Now. That's right. Sometimes we pull this out. That's right. Have you got one? I was thinking we need to print a few of these here at Centennial, right? When there's something that's been hanging on, some little job to do, and it just isn't getting done. What do you need? You need someone who will get around to it, right? But when we start talking about the present in time, there's no time like the present. That's literally true, isn't it? When you want to get something done, nothing can ever get done except right now, right? The past is gone. The future isn't here yet. You only have right now for anything to happen. So you could say there's no time but the present. There really is no other time, is there? That's something we don't usually think about. There's no time but right now. And as soon as we've had that present moment, it's gone, right? Only God lives a now that is forever. Last week, when the spirit of Christmas past came to visit Mr. Scrooge, it was kind of a wispy, ephemeral, but brilliant light. Right? It was there, but not there. Intimate and yet distant, just like our memories. Remember that? Our memories. And you remember our memories can be quite selective, right? If you're not sure about that, ask your spouse. Or better yet, just watch people testify before Congress. I don't recall that conversation, right? I can't remember. That's how the past is. But when the ghost of Christmas present comes to Scrooge, he's nothing like that at all. In fact, Scrooge is waiting after the clock tower chimes and nothing happens. And then it dawns on him that there's light kind of leaking out from the door to his parlor. A parlor that is usually dark and drab and pretty much empty. But he gets up and he goes and opens the door and we'll share what happens. But I want you to know first that the Victorian parlor was where people actually lived, at least the wealthy. This is where life happened, where everything happened, where people gathered, where they talked. And so Victorian parlors were always crowded, full of lots of things. This is the room they used to compete with the Joneses, right, and the Kardashians. Everything they had that was worth looking at, they threw into the parlor. But Scrooge's parlor was dark and drab until the ghost of Christmas present appears and the room is suddenly filled, brimming. It becomes like a gigantic, supersized cornucopia, brimming with all the good things that Jesus would call abundant life, that God wants to give every one of us. Fruits and vegetables, flowers, everything that the earth can provide. And so this ghost of Christmas present is nothing like the past. He's hearty and full and real. And he's there to bless Mr. Scrooge. Now, cut to the ancient past where the Hebrew children are fleeing Egypt, slavery. And they leave Egypt following Moses. But what happens? They find themselves wandering in an endless desert without food and water. And they begin to panic, as people do. And they cry out to Moses, and Moses cries out to God, and God provides what? Manna, right? Manna. But manna comes with rules. Remember the story? I know you do. And manna is to be picked when? In the early morning. And how much should they take? Just enough for the day. What they need that day. Their daily bread. As we just prayed, as Jesus reminds us. But what do the people do? They get too much. They're greedy. Well, it's a scary thing to be out in the desert, right? And they've been asked to pick only what they need, but they begin to stuff their containers with as much as they can. And so what happens is they have begun to trust not God, but everything they can hoard, right? Because what they want is an assurance that tomorrow they won't run out of food. And so they begin to love the provision more and trust more than the provider. And what happens to all the manna they have stuffed into their jars? It spoils, it rots, and so does their faith in God. Is that not like Mr. Scrooge himself? Is that not his story? How his deep fear of the world's needs makes him choose to hoard wealth and to keep it to himself and keep it from others. And later, much later, God, through the Deuteronomist, reminds a very forgetful people the lesson in the desert. Do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. Who knew they used that in Hebrew? Tight-fisted. I love it. Rather, you should open your hand willingly to meet the need. God reminds the people who they once were in Egypt and how it was God and God alone on a daily basis who walked them out and into a promised land. So the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge on a field trip, if you will, through his own neighborhood, through the streets of London. And there are those who strut their wealth, right? Very wealthy Victorians, while others shiver in the cold. These are the children of Queen Victoria's London. And so Scrooge is encouraged to look upon what is real. And the ghost wants him to see past hungry, starving faces so that he can see the systems of injustice that lie behind them. He wants Scrooge to know that there is so much that the poor suffer and that riches are made on the backs of somebody. And he's one of them. And the ghost wants Mr. Scrooge to understand and smell the stench of families without hope. And so he walks Scrooge around London. And of course, he wants Mr. Scrooge to understand how his now plays out in the future of others, particularly the Cratchit family, his employee, Bob Cratchit. And so the ghost takes Scrooge to the Cratchit home. And there, in the midst of want, Scrooge discovers joy. And he finds in this crowded little meager house gratitude for what they have. And of course, he discovers Tiny Tim. And he learns that Tim is dying of a disease that his parents don't have the resources to combat. And Bob Cratchit shares with his wife a comment Tiny Tim makes on their way home from worship that Christmas morning. He hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, Victorian language. And it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Tiny Tim is not asking for miracles on his behalf. He's not asking for pity. He simply offers himself as he is for God's purpose in the hearts of others. And Scrooge is shocked to discover ignorance and want beneath the robes, the grand robes of the ghost of Christmas present. He tells them these are the children of humanity, ignorance and want. I don't know, so I don't have to take responsibility for the want of others. And most of all, Scrooge discovers that he has a very present capacity to change one family's future. One family. This amazing gift or present that we have of the present is where God chooses to meet us. God is here now in our present, casting the mighty from their thrones, filling up the hungry with all the good things that filled Scrooge's parlor, the good things that God wants for all babies and children and teens and moms and dads and middle-aged people and elderly people. All of that is offered to us in the now, because that's where God chose to meet us. Never forget that little manger scene that we love to romanticize was a place of abject poverty. But that's where God chose to meet us in our now. And so as long as children are in cages or sleep in cars or continue to be bought and sold in sordid markets, the Christ child comes to us in our present, in our now, asking us to give the gift that we can do now to change their future. Don't be tight-fisted. Rather, open your hands and your hearts willingly to the needs of the children in our midst.